Fatal attractions. The scotch burned Michael Winston's throat as he stared at the wedding band on his left hand. The gold caught the hotel room's dim light, mocking him with its gleam. He should take it off. He always took it off, but tonight his fingers refused to cooperate. 15 years of marriage reduced to a ritual of removal and replacement. Monica would be at her conference for 3 more days. 3 days during which she'd save lives in operating rooms while he, what? Destroyed them in hotel rooms? The familiar self-loathing rose like bile. He grabbed his phone, thumb hovering over Rachel's message. Room 718. Don't make me wait. They'd met at the airport bar 6 hours ago. He had rules about this. Never in Minneapolis, never where colleagues might see, never with someone who could trace him back to Monica. Rules that kept his carefully compartmentalized life from imploding. But Rachel was different. Something about her drew him in. Maybe the confident way she carried herself, or how her business casual outfit was just a touch too perfect. When she'd mentioned she was also married, he should have walked away. Instead, he'd leaned closer, captivated by her perfectly normal charm. "You're not like the others," she'd said over her untouched martini. "There's something interesting about you. Something substantial." The compliment shouldn't have affected him so strongly. He'd heard similar lines before, but something about her attention made him feel simultaneously special and slightly unnerved. For the first time, he wondered if his serial infidelity wasn't about the sex at all, but about this moment, the precipice between restraint and freefall. His phone buzzed again. "I know you're still in the lobby, Michael." He looked up, scanning the hotel's dimly lit bar. She must have seen him from the elevator. The scotch churned in his stomach as his conscience made one last attempt at intervention. Delete the messages. Call Monica. Confess everything. Go home. But even as the thoughts formed, his feet were moving toward the elevator. The wedding ring felt like a brand on his finger, but he couldn't take it off. Not tonight. Tonight, he needed the reminder of what he was about to betray. As the elevator doors closed, he caught a glimpse of his reflection. He looked tired, drawn. The doors opened on the 7th floor, and he stepped into the hushed corridor. Room 718 waited at the end, a dark maw ready to swallow the last of his excuses. He raised his hand to knock, the gold band glinting one final time before Rachel opened the door. She looked exactly as she had at the bar, attractive but not unnaturally so, successful but not threatening. "I knew you'd come," she said with a perfectly ordinary smile. "We're the same, you and I. We both know what we want." Their first night together was intoxicating. Rachel moved with a grace that seemed practiced yet somehow ancient. Her skin burned fever-hot against his, and in the darkness, he could have sworn her eyes gleamed. By morning, he felt drained, yet craved more, a new addiction taking hold. After that first night with Rachel, Michael spent hours in the shower, as if hot water could wash away what he'd done. This wasn't like his other affairs. Quick, forgettable encounters that he could lock away in the darkest corners of his mind. Rachel had gotten under his skin in a way no one else had. His past indiscretions played through his mind like a slideshow of shame. Jennifer from accounting, whose transfer request he'd had to approve after things ended badly. Katerina, the pharmaceutical rep who'd nearly told Monica everything after he'd broken it off via text. Sophie, the young attorney who'd quit the firm rather than face him in partner meetings. And Rebecca, whose husband had confronted him at a charity gala, causing a scene that Monica had somehow believed was about a botched real estate deal. Each time he'd sworn it would be the last. Each time he'd spent weeks being the perfect husband, bringing Monica coffee in bed, attending every one of their sons' soccer games, planning romantic dinners. The guilt would fade, and then he'd find himself in another city, another hotel bar, another woman's arms. 3 weeks had passed since that first night with Rachel. Their encounters had grown more frequent, more desperate. Chicago, where she'd appeared at his hotel without him telling her where he was staying. Detroit, where they'd spent a weekend that left him barely able to walk. Boston, where she'd known about Jennifer from accounting, an affair he'd never told anyone about. Each meeting followed a pattern, her skin burning against his, that impossible feeling of being consumed, and afterward, a bone-deep exhaustion that lasted for days. He'd started keeping concealer in his briefcase to hide the dark circles under his eyes. His suits, perfectly tailored just months ago, hung loose on his increasingly gaunt frame. But Rachel was different. She knew things she couldn't possibly know. During their weekend in Detroit, she'd casually mentioned the bracelet he'd bought Katerina, a detail he'd never shared with anyone. In Boston, she'd brought up the exact words he'd used to end things with Sophie. When he'd asked how she knew these things, she'd simply smiled and changed the subject. Monica had started leaving pamphlets for marriage counseling on his desk. Last week, she'd asked if he was having a midlife crisis. "You look exhausted all the time," she'd said over dinner. "The kids say you fell asleep at David's piano recital, and you're losing so much weight. I'm worried about you, Michael." He'd blamed work stress, poor sleep, and too much travel. But sitting in his office now, staring at his reflection, he barely recognized himself. His cheekbones stood out sharply in his pale face. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. And the dreams, God, the dreams. Every night since meeting Rachel, he dreamed of being consumed, of burning from the inside out while a dark figure watched with glowing eyes. His phone buzzed. "Rachel. Dinner tonight? I'm in town for one more day." His fingers trembled as he typed his reply. "Can't. Monica's suspicious. She says I look sick." The response came immediately. "Your office, 7 p.m. Don't make me wait, Michael. You know you'll come." She was right. He would go, just like he'd gone every other time she'd called, just like he'd broken every rule he'd established over years of careful infidelity. Something about Rachel made his usual self-control evaporate. The day dragged. By 6:30, his office building had emptied, except for the cleaning crew. Michael loosened his tie, feeling unusually warm despite the aggressive air conditioning. His hands shook as he reviewed quarterly reports, the words swimming before his eyes. At precisely 7, a knock at his door. Rachel entered without waiting for his response. She wore a simple black dress that somehow looked both professional and provocative. Her skin glowed with health, the opposite of how he felt. "You look terrible, Michael," she said, perching on the edge of his desk. Her familiar fever-warm hand touched his cheek. "Guilt eating at you?" "Your wife isn't the only one who's noticed changes," Rachel said, trailing her fever-hot fingers along his shoulder. "Your secretary thinks you're dying. Your partners are discussing asking you to take a leave of absence. Even your children sense something's wrong. Your daughter asked Monica if you have cancer." She leaned close, her breath scorching against his ear. "But you can't stop, can you? Even knowing what this is doing to you, you still came when I called." "I can't do this anymore," he said, but made no move to pull away from her touch. "Monica's asking questions. She scheduled a doctor's appointment for me." Rachel smiled. "Doctors can't help with what ails you." She traced a finger down his jaw. "Do you know why I chose you, Michael? My charm and good looks?" He tried to joke, but his voice sounded hollow. "I choose carefully. Men like you, serial adulterers, destroyers of trust, men who won't be missed because they've already damaged everything good in their lives." Her finger moved to his lips. "I've watched you for months. 5 affairs in 3 cities, all those broken hearts, shattered marriages. How do you know about?" "I know everything about you, Michael Winston. Every woman you've seduced, every life you've ruined, every bit of love you've squandered." Her smile widened. "That's why you're perfect. No one will look too hard when you're gone. They'll assume you ran away with another woman. Monica will mourn, then move on. Your children will remember you as the father who abandoned them." Michael tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. "What are you talking about? What do you mean, when I'm gone?" "Look at yourself, Michael. Really look. You're not sick. You're not stressed. You're being consumed." She gestured to his reflection in the office window. "I feed on men like you. Your type of sin has sustained my kind for millennia." As Rachel revealed her true form, Michael saw his life with terrible clarity. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment of weakness had led him here. He'd destroyed his marriage long before Rachel appeared. She was just the culmination of a path he'd chosen years ago. His reflection showed a man who looked 70, not 45. Hair completely white, skin sagging, eyes sunken. He tried to scream, but no sound emerged. "Succubi traditionally seduce virtuous men," Rachel continued conversationally, "but I prefer sinners. less competition, and frankly, you deserve it more. Her skin began to shimmer. Besides, the corrupted soul of a faithless man burns longer. 3 weeks of feeding on you has been satisfying. Michael's heart hammered as Rachel's form shifted. Wings unfurled from her shoulders, her eyes glowed like embers, and her smile revealed teeth too sharp to be human. "The best part?" she whispered, leaning close. "You chose this. Every step of the way, you chose your fate." His last thought before darkness claimed him was of Monica and how he'd never have the chance to make things right. 3 days later, the cleaning crew found Michael Winston's body in his office. The medical examiner would be baffled by his apparent age, estimated at least 30 years older than his actual age. The only clue was his wedding ring, polished to an unnatural shine, and a note in elegant handwriting written on the back of a marriage counseling pamphlet Monica had given him just days before. He chose his fate. In another city, another bar, Rachel sat with her martini untouched. Across from her, a married man twisted his wedding ring and talked about his business travels. She smiled, knowing his type all too well. They never did understand, these men, how each small betrayal was a step toward their own destruction, how their choices created a beacon that drew creatures like her. After all, some hungers never end, and some fates are chosen one guilty kiss at a time.